Welcome to this very special episode of Boots on the Ground, where we discuss Israel's war, politics, and identity. For this week, I'm joining here from Los Angeles, and Shaun's joining us from somewhere in Samaria, in the Shechem region, in reserve duty. We're going to talk about what's going on in Israeli politics, the current crises that we have with the coalition, what we think is going to bring the coalition down, and when we think that's going to happen. And before we get into that, like always, we want to say thank you to our partners at Jerusalem Media Group and to our sponsors at BeThereIsrael.com. BeThereIsrael.com provides live video streaming services for all of your events in Israel. So even if you can't physically be at the event in Israel, you can join live on video. And now let's get into the show. Before we start, Shaun, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Ari. As you can see, I'm still on reserve duty. Expect to be here for a good few months, but I'm doing good, thanks. How's everything in LA?
Relaxing. There's nothing like being on the beach, talking about being a strong Jewish nation and helping spread the good word. All right. So what do we think about the current coalition crises?
Well, I think before we discuss the current coalition crisis, we also need to discuss what do we mean by the current coalition and what are the problems that Netanyahu as prime minister could be facing in the next few months that will lead to a potential crisis in his coalition. So I'm going to set the groundwork for the way I see it. Netanyahu right now has a semi-stable coalition. We need 120 of the 120 Chavrei Knesset. You need a majority of 61 to maintain a coalition. Netanyahu has well beyond that threshold at the moment, with the Likud party, Shas, the Aguda, which is the other Haredi party, and a weird combination of the religious Zionist party that includes Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir. So with that configuration, right now he has a majority. And as I'm sure you're going to point out in a minute, there are at least 4 things that can bring down his government at any moment.
Yeah. So the 4 things that they've been brewing since the beginning of the current government. There's, as always, on the table is the Haredi draft law that supposedly has to be passed within the next month, I believe. On top of that, we have Ben Gvir's ultimatum, where he threatened to leave the coalition unless the coalition passes the death to terrorists law within the next 30 days. On top of that, we have the budget that has to be passed in March. And we also have the current war and the deal with Trump and the lack of fighting and the lack of victory and how that's going to affect the coalition partners. Those are what I see as the big 4 pitfalls along the way, with the budget being at the very bottom of that list.
Okay, so let's go through each one. While we were discussing, I put these all down. So the very first one we said, in this case, is the Haredi draft law. Now, you and I have discussed what this actually means, but right now, Netanyahu needs the 2 Haredi parties to maintain his coalition. Together, they make up 14 seats, which is a huge chunk. Without them, he can't make a coalition. Without him, he loses his stewardship as prime minister. But at the same time, the Haredim are needed for any future coalition as well. There's almost no combination that anyone can make without one or probably both of the Haredi parties. Now, according to a Supreme Court...
I'm going to give you a caveat on that. That's given the current parties that are in the Knesset. That doesn't take into account any new parties that can or probably will come up in the next election, both on the left and the right. And we
Correct.
forget that there's multiple seats on the current part of the opposition that could join a right-wing coalition if Bibi's not prime minister, namely Avigdor Lieberman with his, I think he has currently 6 seats.
Right. So there's always
a caveat,
the wild card option.
Right there.
Right. So there are the wild card options. Now, that is an important. You did bring up something very important because the Haredi parties are also reading the map the same way, and they understand if they bring down the government because of the Haredi draft, there is a chance that for the first time in many, many years, they will be outside of the coalition, and therefore the government of the day, whether it's left or right, based on exactly what you pointed out, these new parties could pass a Haredi draft law, and then the Haredim are stuck. They're out of the coalition, they're out of the government. They can't prevent a Haredi draft law, and any sanctions or economic benefits that the Haredim currently have can be taken away from them. So the Haredim are threatening that they will bolt the coalition if there's a Haredi draft law, but they also know if they bolt the coalition, they lose not only the current government, but any possible any future representation. So it's very dangerous for them to, if you want to say, pull that trigger and leave the coalition, because they could lose double.
In theory, again, like what I said also, it's a gamble for every side. It's a risk, and it all depends on how you assess that risk. It could also be that they're looking at it. I'll play devil's advocate for a minute. It could be that they're looking at the same situation. They're saying we can bolt the government, and let's say that worst case scenario comes to be that a coalition forms without them. Right, left, center, doesn't matter, forms without them. Would that coalition actually be able to enforce any sort of legislation that they passed? And I think that they don't believe they either will be able to or they'd be willing to enforce it. The same way they're not willing to enforce the law in the books at the moment, which is that they all have to be drafted.
So I don't necessarily think it's about the law. That yes, the Knesset, in a strange combination, sometime in the future, could pass a Haredi draft law. It's not only about that; it's also about the economic incentives and the economic sanctions that the Haredi community could face. Like you said, any government can pass a Haredi draft law that might not necessarily be practical, and the implications get dragged out sometimes months or even years. But what can be immediately impacting on the Haredi government, on the Haredi parties and their voters, is if the government says that the current benefits that yeshiva students get, male yeshiva students who refuse to draft, sit in yeshiva all day, they get a significant amount of financial benefits. The government can cancel those. There are also a bunch of side benefits. For example, there are discounts that they get to send their kids to kindergarten. There are discounts they get because they are below a certain economic threshold when it comes to paying rates and taxes and assessment in the towns and cities where they live. Those benefits can also be taken away. There are also certain food benefits that they get because they're below a certain economic standard. All of these benefits can be taken away, and they will significantly impact the current Haredi population in Israel more immediately than a potential draft. So that risk, I don't think the Haredi want to take. They can deal with a draft, they can threaten, they can protest. There is enough manpower to stop it from happening. While I do think there needs to be some type of draft happening, the economic incentives are first and foremost the economic incentives that they could lose are the bigger threat at the moment, the way I see it, to the Haredi community.
Which is going to be the reality, doesn't matter who or what comes into power in the next government. The reality is that the only way there's ever going to be any movement on the issue of Haredi drafting, it's going to be through economic incentives and disincentives. So that's a reality no matter who's in charge. The question is how extreme those measures are going to be one way or the other, depending on who's steering the ship at any given time. And I think that, I don't think the Haredi parties are necessarily going to be the ones that would bring the government down due to a law being passed that changes those economic incentives. I think it would actually be members of the Likud or a rogue member of Smotrich's party that has kind of just gotten fed up with the reality and said enough is enough, and we're not willing to be part of this anymore, and they bring down the coalition. On top of the
so then,
I think that, because again,
I hear what you said.
We've spoken about this many times in episodes past. I don't want to get stuck on it, but I think that the bare minimum that the rest of the coalition partners are demanding is still too much from that the Haredi community could agree to, at least their leadership could agree to. I think there's a big difference on the Haredi leadership to the Haredi community. We're not going to get into that now, but the reality being that those two minimums, there's still distance between them, and one side's going to have to say no. And I don't think it's going to be the Haredi side that says no. I think it's going to be the other members of the coalition.
Okay, so that I think we've drawn this point out enough. I can't see the Haredim bringing down the government. It's too much of a risk for their voters, and therefore it'll have too much of an impact on the political leadership as well. So I don't see the Haredim pulling the trigger on this.
I don't either. I see it as something that's like it's a gun that is being used as a threat, but I think that everyone knows it's full of blanks and not actual bullets. I think that's the reality, which is why I dafka think that it's going to be what I had third on the list or last on the list that's going to bring down. Let's first get into Ben Gvir's ultimatum of the death for terrorist law that he has to pass within 30 days or he's leaving. So,
okay, so do you want to explain what that law is?
So, since the previous election, Ben Gvir has been trying to pass a law that says death for convicted terrorists, where basically the law is instead of having terrorists sit in prison in Israel, being funded through the Israeli government, that there'd be a death sentence. It's already technically on the books for Nazis and Nazi collaborators. It's been used once in Israel's history on Eichmann, and he wanted to broaden that law to include different instances of modern day terrorism, mainly the Muslim terrorists in Israel that successfully murder Jews, that instead of them sitting in prison on life sentences to then be released in future peace deals or hostage release deals, or you call them whatever you want, that they would be given the death penalty. And it would solve that issue, and it would be a massive disincentive for terrorism. He's been trying to pass that law since he got elected, and he gave an ultimatum a few days ago that if it's not passed within the next 30 days, he's going to bolt the coalition. And I also think that's an empty threat because it would take it's very hard to pass a law through all three readings in 30 days, especially when the first reading, as far as of recording this, hasn't been brought up for a vote in the Knesset. It's also a very complicated law because how do you write it in a way that would affect only Muslim terrorists and not Jews who are convicted of terrorism as well? Because no one wants a death sentence for Jews convicted of terrorism. And that would just complicate it. So I think that it's more of a known empty threat that he's using as an early election ploy, sort of to shore up his own base. Again, it's Ben Gvir, you never know. Maybe he's being serious, maybe not. But to me, it seems like it's just him trying to shore up his base before an election.
I couldn't agree more. I think there are way too many complications creating a law like this, and also the practical implications. A law of this magnitude, even if it does pass 2 or 3 readings in the Knesset to become law, there is no way it will stand up to rigorous challenges at the current Supreme Court. There will be dozens of petitions from various different political entities, from human rights groups. And let's not forget, right now, Israel is on the verge of losing a lot of sponsorship deals with the European Union. One of the most important aspects of the European Union is they will not enter into any major economic deals with what they call partner countries, that Israel is one of them, if you still maintain the death sentence. And an example of that is Turkey. Turkey, for many, many years, people thought, well, they could join the EU. They're regarded as a partner of the EU. And then almost overnight, the EU cut off all major deals with Turkey. We're going back about 15 years ago. And that is because at the time, Turkey refused to give up the death sentence for convicted murderers in Turkey. Now, that changed over time. But right now, Israel is facing a number of political and economic challenges with partners in the European Union. If we go ahead with this almost on a whim, it has major economic impact on Israel that we are not ready to deal with. And then exactly like you said, Ben Gvir's personality, I think this is him just shooting his mouth off.
All right, so let's get into number 3 now, which I talked about the budget before we get into what I think is really the meat and potatoes of the current coalition crisis. The budget has to be passed, I believe it's March. I might be off by a little bit. And there's always, again, if the budget doesn't pass, then there's automatic elections called. The reality is that the budget, there's no major argument or fight over the budget outside of different financing for the Haredi community. which again, as in years past, it'll be solved in whatever way, this way or that everyone will agree to in order to pass a budget and prevent an election. There's no major changes coming up in the budget. There's no planned or spoken about reforms that on any significant major level that would cause great arguments within the coalition. So again, it's an issue, but a non-issue that I don't think is really going to come out. So let's just fast forward straight to what I think is going to be the biggest crux of the issue, and that's going to be the continued implementation of the Trump plan and the continuation or the return to combat in Gaza.
I'm good to go into that. Just one thing I do want to bring up: the current Minister of Finance is Bezalel Smotrich, with the regarded as the settler right-wing party. He took over the finance ministry with a lot of great discussion about reforming the budget, about making significant cuts, and he had a relatively good reputation as an organizer at various levels. He completely reformed the Ministry of Transportation. He put a number of major developments into place, and there was a lot of high hopes among his own supporters that as Minister of Finance, he could actually not only balance the budget, but make some pretty good decisions about where to make cuts, and ensure that the budget didn't go into significant overruns, which is all happening at the moment. The budget is going to be significantly larger than it has been in the past. The defense budget is huge, and significant cuts need to be made almost everywhere. But the Haredi probably won't face the same amount of cuts as everyone else.
I agree with you. I also think that just looking at Smotrich's managing of the budget as a person, he overpromised and very significantly underdelivered. It didn't get reported much of the time before the war, but there was major compromises made towards both the teachers' unions and the regular labor unions in Israel that continued their stranglehold on the economy. He didn't, given the opportunity for a war, when everyone recognizes that the budget has to be shifted, instead of cutting massive pieces of the budget that are, most people would agree that are wasteful, he just added more on. Instead of cutting from elsewhere, he just expanded the budget, which was easier and caused less of a fight. And he used the idea that now is not the time to create fighting inside, but more just let's solve the immediate problem and we'll push that fight off for another day. I don't think he's going to do very much. I think his whole deal is going to be, I'm not going to ruffle any feathers with this budget, make everybody happy at the expense of the future generations that are going to be paying for it, and move on from there.
Right.
But again, I still think that exactly. He's increasing the national debt to cover the expense.
Yeah.
Which again just means that we'll be paying for years to come.
And I think that will actually harm Smotrich in future elections, whether it's in the next 3 months, 6 months, or year. Smotrich's inability to properly manage the budget will harm him significantly at the polls.
So there, I'd actually disagree with you completely. I think that his constituency doesn't put such a high priority on the financial aspects of his job. I don't think that he won his seats and his constituency elected him on an economic platform where that was their number one priority. I think he was elected and put in the position that he's in to affect the ideological platform that he represents, which is the ideology of the religious right-wing movement from Judea and Samaria, and that people can argue whether he's doing that well or not. I think that's where his political support comes from, and not the changes he's made or he hasn't made within the financial platform of the country. But let's move on for a minute, and let's get to the war in Gaza. We can always come back to this.
Right. It's important that you bring that up, because I think, in my opinion, that's also where the election blocks are going to switch. So we have the current Trump deal that we've spoken about a couple of times. What are the pitfalls? What are the issues? And how do you think this will actually affect the coalition or bring down the government?
So I think with the Trump deal, there's an enormous amount of ambiguity, and it was written on purpose in a way that two different people can read the same thing and understand two completely different things. It's one of the things I've been noticing the most, especially being here in the United States, is that three different people have five different opinions about what the Trump deal actually is, how it's supposed to be implemented, and what it means. And that's just in the American Jewish Zionist community. The second you expand that out to the lesser Zionist and non-Jewish community, then people understand things that are even furtherly different than what I just represented. So it's very ambiguous. It has more question marks than it does answers. And even within Israel, you see that starting to become a problem where there's talk of having Turkish troops in Gaza. Now, we don't have Turkish troops there right now, but there's a Turkish non-for-profit organization called the IHH, which Israel has labeled a terrorist organization, now operating in Gaza. There's talk of having Qatar involved in Gaza, which, as we all know, is the host and funder of Hamas. So, again, where does America stand on all these issues? No one really knows. The vice president of the United States is in Jerusalem right now, and he made it clear that no foreign troops would be in Gaza unless Israel approved of them. But as we've seen, does Israel really have the ability to veto or to make demands of the international community of what's going to happen? Stage one of the implementation was that all the hostages, dead and alive, were returned. We see that hasn't been fulfilled properly yet all the humanitarian aid that was promised is going in. Israel has fully pulled back to its the first line, as we spoke on in previous episodes, that first line that we pull back to before we do a full pullback, even though Hamas hasn't upheld its side of the deal. So there's a lot of question marks, and I think that's where the pressure is going to be on Netanyahu internally, where there's going to be the Smotrich Ben Gvir wing of his coalition is going to be pushing very strongly to say, all right, this deal is no longer relevant, off the table. Can we please get back to finishing this war instead of dragging it out? While within the Likud camp, within his own party, there's going to be separate factions, one supporting him in kind of playing it on the waiting game to see what happens, where there's going to be other members of this coalition that are already calling for renewed fighting. And who knows where the Haredim stand in this whole thing, and who in the coalition is going to promise them what in order to get them to side with them. But I think that's what's going to bring the largest pitfall for the current coalition, and the ability to keep it together is going to be very dependent on what happens on an almost daily basis in Gaza.
Okay, this is where I'm going to disagree with you, because I think it's actually a done deal. The fighting is not going to restart. Whether we think it is ambiguous and we think that Israel got the raw end of this deal, or that Hamas is rebuilding, whatever negative situation you want to see in this, I don't see this as something that will bring down the government. Because let's say right now that a third of the Likud party says we want to go back to war, and they bolt. At the same time, Smotrich and Ben Gvir said the same thing. We don't want to have any part of this. We're out as well. We need to go back to war. So the government falls. Netanyahu is caretaker. There's no mechanism that says, okay, I've lost my coalition. We go back to fighting. It doesn't work like that. He still stays in as caretaker. He's still there's still the Minister of Defense. There is no ability to return to fighting. We then have to go back to it. We then go to a 90-day election cycle. Then we have another, in some cases, 2 to 3 months of renegotiating for a new coalition. And then you have a couple of months of a new government that includes a new defense minister, a new minister of finance. And then we are nearly a year later. We're not going back to war. It's a done deal. The threats of, well, we have to go back to war or anything else, it's possibly an excuse based on the other options we spoke about. But pulling the plug now and saying this is a bad deal, we need to go back to war, and leaving the coalition, it's not going to happen.
So I think, like you're saying, it's an excuse to have an election, but it also, if you look at every election as a referendum, in the end of the day, an election is a referendum on who's representing us. And it's very easy. A lot of times in Israel, you can make an election about a very specific subject. if the election, the subject of the election is should we be fighting or should we not be fighting, and that becomes the referendum question of the election, and the votes break along those lines for the different parties that will represent, the spectrum of absolutely not to absolutely yes and everything in the middle, then whatever future coalition is formed, that's the direction where they're going to go in. I don't think anyone actually believes that we're going to bring the coalition down because we demand to go back to fighting, and that the fighting is going to automatically start the day that coalition collapses or after a new election or whenever. I think there's the reality, like you said, of the time frame. Well, I don't think it's as drawn out or as long as you presented it. It is definitely along those lines and close to it, but it makes that the issue of the election. I don't think that the budget or anything we spoke about along the budget lines or the death for terrorist law is going to in any way, shape, or form be the subject of the election and therefore the national referendum. I think it's going to be either yes or no to continued fighting in Gaza, and yes or no, and what flavor of a Haredi draft law should be implemented. I think those are the two issues that stand at the forefront of any coalition fighting at the moment.
It's all of those. I wouldn't say it should we go back to fighting. It, like I've said before, it's a done deal. We're not going to go back to fighting. As much as I think we didn't finish this job properly, we didn't deal with Hamas the way we should have, we didn't defeat Hamas the way we were promised, if you want to call it that. We're not going back to fighting under the current government, and I can't see a future government, even with new parties, suddenly one day saying, yeah, we're going to go back and invade Gaza. None of those things are going to happen, and I think the referendum, as you call it, is going to be more on the other lines of what is the role of the army? What is the role of Israel's defense? What is the budget going to be? What is a new Haredi draft law going to be? It's going to be a combination of all of those things. And now I need to come back to Smotrich as well. As you said that, rightly said, many of the people who vote for him, his base are ideologues, people who ideologically believe in settling Yudan and Shomron and settling the West Bank, and ideological ideas that are regarded very much as the classical new Israeli right. Many of those people will leave, and I already say they will leave Smotrich. They will support a new right-wing organization or a new right-wing party that pulls Israel away from, will support a new right-wing party that opposes Smotrich because he has, if you want to call it, he's waned in his ideology. He's become too much of a compromiser, and he's going to stick too much on the, well, I created all these settlements. That's not what people are looking for. That's great that we created settlements in the West Bank, but the army failed in one of its primary missions. It's great that he's going to speak about the fact that he brought people together to make a budget, but nobody who voted for him wanted him to bring people together over the budget. They want him to create a sound budget, an ideological budget, which he didn't do. So I think that is going to be, he is going to be one of the parties that lose out significantly in the future. And the breakup of his supporters will leave a major hole in a future election that an ideological right-wing party will probably fill. The same is true for the left, that no left-wing party at the moment has been able to fulfill the ideological gap that many in the left are looking for.
Right. So I think that the two different gaps you're referring to on the right and on the left, it's going to be very interesting to watch in the next election to see which parties come out and are created and fill those gaps. I think the biggest gap on the left that's becoming apparent is that the left became an anti-Bibi party. It became a coalition of anything but Bibi and not Bibi, and they made Bibi the issue of their elections instead of what yes. They made their election all about who no, but not about what yes. And I think that at least I know of multiple different groups forming on the left side of the map that are bringing together some of that ideology back, some of that motivation back, saying, listen, this is the reality. Let's vote for something. Let's be productive. Let's be positive, and not let's talk about more than just who no, but let's talk about what we actually stand for and want to accomplish. I think that's gonna
I,
shift around shift around the left side of the map, but I don't think that those votes are necessarily going to shift from left to right or right to left very much. I think your assessment of Smotrich is right, and he's going to be, again, neither one of us are prophets, unfortunately. But the reality is that the map on the right is going to shift as well. I think the one thing that's going to be surprising, which is not showing up in the polls at all right now, is that the Likud, depending again who forms what on the right, I do think the Likud is going to lose a little bit of its strength. That's just the reality. I think that's looking at reality. I don't think they're going to disappear. I don't think they're going to become significantly weaker, but I do think they're going to have to fight much harder to keep the last few seats that they have at the moment, those at the end of their list. And time will tell where politics goes. But I definitely think the next election is going to be around the Haredi drafting and what and how we do in Gaza. And I think that to say that we're not going to go back to fighting in Gaza is a little bit overkill, in the sense that, as we've seen, especially over the last 2 years, starting Simchat Torah 2 years ago, we really have no idea what can happen, and we can be surprised. Hamas already tried one significant attack in Rafiah a few days ago. All you need is one attack like that to succeed, and you have all the justification in the world to go right back to fighting without anyone arguing with you. To think that that's not going to come is a little naive. That's going to happen. The question is to what extent will it succeed or not, and if we'll be able to capitalize on that opportunity to then again restart to finish the job that we started 2 years ago. And I think that's what the referendum is
okay.
going to be about. Who's going to be captaining the ship when the next opportunity arises?
Okay. So again, I don't see that happening. I don't see us going, no matter, it's going to take something really massive for us to go back to fighting, and I don't see anything like that at the moment. There is one other aspect that we haven't brought up, and I think that might play a more significant role in potentially bringing down the government, but also into anything that comes out in the future, and that is the blame game and responsibility for the failures of October 7th. Now,
Right.
the first thing that is supposed to happen at the end of the war is the government is supposed to appoint an investigatory committee. In Hebrew, it's called a Vadat Hakira Mamlachti, which is the highest level of investigation committee you can put together. That includes Supreme Court justices and a host of neutral investigators from the military, from the civil service, from the judiciary, and from the government. Now, right now, the government is doing everything in their power to delay that committee because they're actually supposed to appoint a committee that they have no control over, and they don't want to do that because the committee will provide a scathing report of the government, of the Ministry of Defense, and it will look horrible for Netanyahu. As much as he can say that I had nothing to do with it, I was the prime minister only for a few months or even a year, at the end of the day, any investigatory committee will come up with significant recommendations, and Netanyahu will look terrible. The Likud will look horrible. And it's going to look even worse because they're doing their best to delay this committee. And right now, that might be one of the, if you want to call it the trump card, that the anti-Bibi stim, the anti-Bibi group are going to play is, you are responsible for the greatest failure in the history of Israel. And rather than take you're actually delaying an investigation to take responsibility for it. That might be one of the things that brings down the government internally, because the longer they delay, the worse it looks for all of Netanyahu's partners, with the exception of the Haredi parties.
Right, except again, everyone who's in the Bibi camp to begin with, everyone who's in the current coalition camp recognizes that committee of inquiry is not going to be impartial and isn't going to be neutral, and that there's no ability at the moment. There's no such thing as a neutral person, especially not in Israel's hyper-polarized politics at the moment. You're not going to find any current or former Supreme Court justice that has neutral feelings on the reality. And then again, one of the many aspects that have to investigate would be the judicial branch's involvement in creating the reality for the current war. And no one's going to trust them to investigate themselves, the same way no one trusts the army to investigate itself. So that commission of inquiry, no matter who's running it, is not going to be impartial, is not going to be neutral. And the people in the Bibi camp, the yes Bibi camp, are all saying that that committee isn't going to be impartial, so why create it? So I don't think it's going to have a problem inside the committee. I think, again, it's a national question. It's a committee that's going to have to be created inevitably at some point by somebody. And it's going to have a scathing report only because such a colossal failure clearly means enormous amount of not just people, but systems that were in place failed. And there's going to have to be a reckoning with it. The reality, that's just the reality. Again, it's not going to happen under the current coalition. It's probably not going to happen under the next coalition, depending who's involved in any significant way. But that is going to be a major referendum question the next election of how to go about investigating this, especially considering it involved everyone and everything that was supposed to prevent it from happening.
Right. So that's where I think any new coalition, any new parties that come about, right or left, that will be one of their issues. Is we want to create this commission of inquiry, and I think many people on the right at the moment, people within the Likud, are recognizing that the longer that they delay, even if we acknowledge that any investigative committee will not be neutral, and in some cases it might actually be more anti-Netanyahu, which is a huge problem. But the longer you delay setting up this committee, the worse it looks for the current government. The worse it looks for Netanyahu, the worse it looks for the Likud, the worse it looks for Smotrich, even the worse it looks for Ben Gvir. And they want to do it, and they're caught in a situation where the more they delay, the longer they delay, the more voters they could potentially lose to a new right-wing party. At the same time, the left wing will capitalize on this because many of the anti-Bibi people can stand up and say, "We told you so, we told you so, we told you so." And at the same time, a new left-wing party can also be more moderating and say, "Yes, Bibi is wrong, but it's not just about Netanyahu; it's about all the systems that failed, and therefore we need a stronger, more ideological, more logical left-wing opposition."
Correct. So we're back to where we started, but I don't think that's going to bring down the coalition.
I don't think it's the one thing that'll bring down the coalition, but I think that will be a major point in the future election, which will probably be within the next 6 to 8 months.
Right. So that'll be, again, like we said, so we can add that to the list of what the national referendum is going to be on. So we have a list of 3 items that we're going to be voting on, basically, which is how and in what capacity we should change the realities around the Haredi drafting, how and what should be changed vis-a-vis our stance towards Gaza, and then how we should go about investigating and implementing changes to make sure that we understand how the colossal failures of 2023 happened and how to prevent them from happening again in the future. And that brings us to the end of the show, Shaun. So before we end, as always, we want to share positive. What are your positive thoughts being back in reserve duty?
So being back in reserve duty is always challenging. As was pointed out to us, this is going to be the 3rd October, November, December in a row that we are away from our families. That means we have now done nearly a year of reserve duty in the last 2 years, and it is hard. But within all that, I'm with a group of guys that are younger than me, some are my age, that day to day I have nothing to do with the exception of the army. From people who are if you want to call the ultimate Tel Aviv hippies, to people who live on hilltops here in the Shomron, to high-tech executives, to lawyers, to students, people who are recently married, recently divorced, new kids, old kids, across the ideological spectrum, across the religious spectrum. And the other day we were sitting discussing politics for the first time in a while. And I realized one of the things that came up was nobody really cared. We don't care what your ideology is. We don't care that you're left. We don't care that you're right. We just need to get the job done. And people are almost tired of politics when you're in the army. And I enjoyed that. We have a job to do, and politics is something that has been so poisonous to the Israeli discourse for so long. And at least here in the army, even when politics kind of becomes a conversation point, people are just, nah, we're done with that. Can we move on? Let's discuss something else.
All right. So the funny thing is if everyone notices, I'm recording. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm here speaking and doing a lot of different events. But one of the beauties is that I'm on the beach. If you look over my shoulder, that's the ocean right there, and there's this great path that goes for miles and miles along the coast. So every morning when I wake up, in order to, because I'm sitting around and speaking, I'm not very active when I'm here. I go for a run every morning, all the way down the beach and then back. And it was yesterday morning. I'm running and I'm wearing on purpose. I wear my army shirt. It's got Hebrew on the back. It's got Hebrew on the front. And there's a lot of guys that bike up and down the path. So this guy on a bicycle pulls up next to me and asks me if that's Hebrew on my shirt. And I said, yes. And he's like, you look like the kind of guy that you're an IDF man. And I'm here in California, and I'm not so sure how to answer because you never know which side of the political aisle someone's going to fall on. But I had a good feeling about this one. So I said, yes, I do serve in the reserves regularly. And he biked alongside me while I'm running, making me keep pace with him, which was an good extra workout. But he went on a whole tirade about how that he's inspired by seeing us actually winning finally, that the West is winning, that the Judeo-Christian world is winning, and that we need to be strong against our enemies, and that we shouldn't back down. We shouldn't back down to Trump. And he gave me this whole speech about he's inspired and motivated by everything we're doing in the Middle East, and that he sees it as a resurgence of morality and values in this world. And then I couldn't keep up with him anymore when he wished me a good day, and he kept going. And it was very inspiring to see that random people on the beach in California are watching what's going on by us and being inspired by it, and are supportive, and that our support in the world, while on the news it seems like it's disappearing, but the overwhelming majority of people that walk by, you can see there's this flag, over this shoulder. There's the Israeli American flag hanging out here on the beach. Everyone that walks by is saying, wow, that's awesome, go Israel. And the random comments, there's an entrance to the beach right here. It's full of either both tourists and locals that come every day and haven't received a single comment yet on it. And I think that there's more quiet support that's just looking for someone to stand up so that they can follow behind them and say, yeah, we support this. And it's been very inspiring for me while I'm here.
All right.
And on that note,
very much.
Thank you. Yeah, on that note, thank you to our partners at the Jerusalem Media Group and our sponsors at BeThereIsrael.com for all your live streaming video services that you may need for events here in Israel. If you can't be there, you can be there live through video streaming with BeThereIsrael.com. And as always, like, share, subscribe. And until next time, Am Yisrael Chai.